Tonight we delve into one of history's most puzzling enigmas, the dancing plague of 1518. In the sweltering summer months of that fateful year, in the free imperial city of Strasbourg, then a part of the Holy Roman Empire, an event began that has left historians blinking slowly at their notes for over 5 centuries. It began with a woman who danced, not at a festival, nor to the sound of cheerful musicians. No, this woman danced alone, without accompaniment, without apparent joy, and perhaps most curiously of all, without any indication that she wanted to stop. What began as the solitary swaying motion of a single individual in the narrow street known as the Frauengasse would soon evolve into something far more mysterious than anyone could have anticipated. Within days she was joined by others, dozens. Then, according to some reports, perhaps even hundreds. They danced in the daylight, they danced in the shade, they danced in the rain, some danced until their feet bled, others, reportedly, danced until their hearts gave out. And most perplexing of all, no one could say exactly why. Before we begin, please consider giving this video a gentle thumbs up if you enjoy these methodically paced historical deep dives. And if you're new here, do subscribe and join our growing community of night owls, gentle thinkers, and insomniacs seeking sleepy stories from the past. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, whether it's your bed, your sofa, or somewhere in between, so do drop a comment below and say hello. And of course, let us know what time it is where you are. We keep no schedule here, only time zones and soft sighs. Now I invite you to get comfortable, adjust your pillows, dim the lights. Perhaps turn on that quiet background hum you find so soothing, a crackling fireplace, a thunderstorm, or the steady murmur of a fan. Make sure your blanket is tucked just right. We'll be taking our time tonight, no need to rush. The pace will be slow, deliberate, and hopefully quite boring. Our story begins in Strasbourg in 1518, a city of narrow stone lanes, cathedral bells, and the occasional faint scent of overripe cabbage wafting through the market stalls. But to fully understand this moment in time, this outbreak of uncontrollable, inexplicable dance, we must first situate ourselves in its world, because in history, context is everything. To understand why people might dance uncontrollably, we must understand the city in which they danced, the political forces that shaped their lives, the bread they ate, the clothes they wore, and the fears they quietly harboured as the bells tolled noon. We must become familiar with Strasbourg, not as a modern European city with internet cafes and trams, but as it was in the early 16th century, a place of guilds, of superstition, of Latin sermons and wooden shoes. And so before we speak of dancing, we must speak of politics. We must speak of the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor particularly Roman, nor truly an empire in the cohesive sense. We must meet the men in robes and chains of office, who governed from their wood-panelled chambers. We must discuss imperial free cities and ecclesiastical jurisdictions, and we must mention more than once the local bishop. Only then can we move forward. Only then can we begin to understand what it meant to dance in the streets of Strasbourg in 1518. Not just to dance, but to do so in a way that frightened one's neighbours, baffled one's magistrates, and ultimately inspired the chroniclers of the age to sit down with a quill, a scroll, and the sense that something very strange had occurred. Interestingly, though the event itself occupies only a few short paragraphs in most medieval chronicles, its legacy has proven surprisingly long-lived. It is referenced in textbooks, whispered about in documentaries, and mentioned occasionally at dinner parties by those who enjoy slipping obscure historical trivia into otherwise polite conversation. Some say it was caused by ergot, a hallucinogenic mold that grew on rye bread. Others suggest mass hysteria, brought on by the relentless pressures of famine, plague, and religious dread. Still others have proposed that it was a kind of ecstatic religious trance gone terribly, terribly wrong, and yet the truth remains elusive. There were no TikToks, no surveillance footage, no first-hand podcasts or Instagram posts, just the occasional mention in a town ledger, and a few bewildered reports by councilmen who were perhaps more accustomed to arguing over bridge repairs than preventing spontaneous dance outbreaks in public squares. What's particularly interesting about this mystery is that, unlike so many historical enigmas, it leaves us with very little in the way of satisfying closure. There are no buried treasure maps, no cryptic stone carvings, no final confessions in dusty letters, just the slow, ponderous accumulation of speculation, repetition, and occasionally gentle laughter. And yet the truth remains elusive. There were no TikToks, no surveillance footage, no first-hand podcasts or Instagram posts, just the occasional mention in a town ledger, and a few bewildered reports by councilmen who were perhaps more accustomed to arguing over bridge repairs than preventing spontaneous dance outbreaks in public squares. What's particularly interesting about this mystery is that, unlike so many historical enigmas, it leaves us with very little in the way of satisfying closure. There are no buried treasure maps, no cryptic stone carvings, no final confessions in dusty letters, just the slow, ponderous accumulation of speculation, repetition, and occasionally gentle laughter. We'll examine the theories, rational and otherwise, and we'll close, as always, with the soft conclusion that history, like sleep, is often best approached with gentle curiosity and no expectation of definitive answers. So please, relax, let the boredom take hold, and prepare to explore the boring mystery of the dancing plague of 1518, a bedtime investigation. To truly understand the strange events that unfolded in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, it is first necessary, indeed absolutely essential, to understand the political structures that governed this curious city. For in the world of the Holy Roman Empire, very little happened without first being shaped, influenced, or mildly inconvenienced by an abundance of titles, councils, jurisdictions, and men with highly decorative hats. Strasbourg, or Strasbourg as it was then spelled, was not merely a town, nor merely a city. It was an imperial free city, which in the terminology of the Holy Roman Empire meant that it answered directly to the emperor himself, though in practice this rarely meant the emperor was particularly interested in answering back. Nonetheless, the status afforded Strasbourg a considerable degree of autonomy in its own affairs. It could levy taxes, administer justice, and pass ordinances without seeking approval from the regional princes, bishops, or counts. It was, in short, free in the way that a goose might be free to honk as it walks in a straight line, so long as it did not stray too far from the pond. In 1518, the Holy Roman Emperor was Maximilian I, or rather, he had been until the start of that year. His death in January had left the empire temporarily without a crowned head, though not without many people jockeying to place one upon it. The succession was a complicated matter, as all things in the Holy Roman Empire tended to be. Candidates included Francis I of France, Henry VIII of England, and of course the eventual winner, Charles V of the House of Habsburg, grandson of Maximilian. Charles V would go on to rule over not only the Holy Roman Empire, but also vast swathes of Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and even the newly claimed territories of the Americas. But in the summer of 1518, Charles was still in negotiations, and Strasbourg, like many imperial free cities, was watching the proceedings with a cautious blend of anxiety, detachment, and politely veiled self-interest. In the absence of an emperor, Strasbourg's local governance took on even greater significance. The city was run by a council, as was common in many free cities. This council was composed of representatives from the various guilds, those professional and trade associations that regulated everything from blacksmithing to baking. The most influential guilds wielded considerable power, and their representatives often formed the majority in the council chamber. These men, always men, met in formal sessions, wore robes of appropriate seriousness, and engaged in lengthy debates over civic matters such as grain prices, bridge maintenance, and, as we shall later see, how best to respond to outbreaks of involuntary rhythmic movement. Above the council sat the Stepmeister, a sort of mayor or chief magistrate. The Stepmeister was not an emperor, nor even a prince, but he was responsible for maintaining order, overseeing the courts, and ensuring that Strasbourg did not descend into chaos or, worse, fiscal mismanagement. His duties were varied, his robes long, and his patience, by most accounts, thoroughly tested by the more eccentric elements of the city's population. It bears repeating that Strasbourg in 1518 was not a place of great political turbulence. It had enjoyed a period of relative stability for several decades. There were occasional uprisings, of course, a dispute about tax grain here, a disagreement over cathedral repairs there, but by and large the city functioned in a state of mild bureaucratic contentment. It was, in the terminology of city chroniclers, orderly, which is to say not interesting. The broader context, however, was less calm. Across the Holy Roman Empire, tensions were brewing. The Protestant Reformation was just beginning to stir. In October of the previous year, 1517, a monk named Martin Luther had nailed his 95 theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, questioning the Catholic Church's practices, particularly the sale of indulgences. While Strasbourg itself had not yet been swept up in the reformist fervour, its religious leaders were already aware of the rumblings. The city was a bishopric, with ecclesiastical authority centred around its grand cathedral. The bishop, then Wilhelm von Honstein, resided not always in the city, but his influence loomed large over its spiritual life. As such, Strasbourg found itself perched awkwardly between the old world and the new. It was a city of tradition, but also of commerce. A city of guilds, but also of growing literacy. A city with a bishop, but also with a council keen to assert its independence from clerical interference. This balance of secular and spiritual power was not always easy to maintain. When a woman began dancing uncontrollably in the streets, it was not immediately clear whether the matter should be handled by a physician, a priest, or a policeman. Interestingly, the jurisdictional overlap between church and city council in Strasbourg was a point of constant friction. The bishop claimed authority over certain moral and doctrinal matters, while the council insisted on its right to govern civic behaviour. This meant that questions of public morality, such as whether spontaneous dancing might constitute sin, illness, or mere disorderliness, were open to multiple interpretations, each with its own set of robes, procedures, and preferred fonts for issuing proclamations. Complicating matters further was the broader geopolitical context of the Holy Roman Empire. The empire itself was a patchwork quilt of over 300 semi-autonomous entities, including duchies, principalities, bishoprics, and cities like Strasbourg. The emperor, once elected, had limited direct control over many of these areas. His power was more symbolic than administrative. Regional rulers exercised a great deal of independence, provided they paid the proper tributes, attended the occasional diet, and refrained from excessive rebellion. Strasbourg's position on the western edge of the empire meant it had cultural and economic ties to both the German-speaking interior and the French-speaking regions just across the Rhine. This gave the city a hybrid character, neither fully German nor fully French, but something in between. Its merchants traded across both language zones, and its council records often included multilingual documentation, which made matters of translation, and sometimes transcription, rather slow. Now, it's worth noting that the city's archives were kept with admirable diligence. Council proceedings were recorded in meticulous handwriting, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in Middle High German, depending on the scribe and the purpose. These records, which include some of the earliest references to the dancing event, show a concern not with scandal or supernatural speculation, but rather with public order. The council's first recorded action was not to inquire whether demons were afoot, but rather whether something ought to be done to prevent further disruption in the Frauengasse. And so we see that the political response to the initial dancing outbreak was deeply rooted in the city's administrative structure. Committees were formed, correspondence was drafted, meetings were scheduled, physicians were consulted, clerics were notified, but at every step the city's political framework ensured that no single individual could act alone. It was not a time for heroic mayors or dramatic interventions. It was a time for lengthy debate, formal letters, and mild consternation. The slow response, as frustrating as it might seem to modern sensibilities, was in many ways a product of the system's strengths. Strasbourg's government prized procedure. It valued precedent. It believed that most problems could be solved by referring them to a relevant subcommittee. And in 1518, that faith in bureaucracy was still largely intact. But as the dancers continued to multiply, and as their motions began to draw crowds, stir gossip, and attract unwanted attention from neighbouring towns, the city council began to realise that something perhaps must be done, and so they did what any responsible city council would do. They ordered an investigation. They summoned the city's best minds. They considered the economic implications of dancing in the marketplace. They even commissioned musicians, in what can only be described as a decision made with the utmost confidence in the power of music to solve medical mysteries. It would not be the last questionable decision they made, yet, to their credit, they documented everything. And thanks to those records, we are able, centuries later, to trace not only the footsteps of the dancers, but the ink trails of the scribes who recorded them. And so it bears repeating that Strasbourg in 1518 was governed not by kings or generals, but by bakers, butchers, and tailors turned councilmen. It was ruled by consensus, shaped by bureaucracy, and defined by its cautious, almost philosophical approach to change, which means that when the dancers began to sway, the city did not panic. It deliberated. And perhaps that is the most Strasbourg thing of all. To understand the curious events of 1518, one must not only examine the political scaffolding that surrounded Strasbourg, but also sink ever so slowly into the fabric of everyday life within the city's walls. For while magistrates deliberated and guilds regulated, the ordinary citizens of Strasbourg continued to do what people do best: eat, pray, work, worry, gossip, and on very rare and confounding occasions, dance involuntarily. Life in early 16th century Strasbourg was, by all accounts, quite orderly, if one's idea of order includes the rhythmic clatter of wooden clogs on cobbled streets, the occasional shouting of livestock traders, and the frequent ringing of church bells. The city, a bustling urban centre by medieval standards, housed somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 inhabitants, a number that, while not large by modern comparison, was more than sufficient to create a rich and often pungent tapestry of human activity. Daily life began early. The sun, though not always visible through the ever-present northern mists, dictated the rhythms of work and rest. The clanging of church bells from Strasbourg's cathedral marked canonical hours, calling people not only to prayer but also to punctuality of a sort. Bakers rose before dawn to knead dough in chill air, their breath visible in flour-dusted kitchens. Merchants unlatched their stalls, blacksmiths stirred coals. Children, if they were not required for domestic chores or apprenticeships, were often sent on errands they would only sometimes complete. The homes of the people varied greatly, depending on wealth and profession. Wealthier families, especially those of merchants and guild leaders, resided in timber-framed houses with steeply pitched roofs and cellars for storing wine or, in some cases, preserved meats. The less prosperous lived in more modest structures, often with shared walls, shared wells, and the unspoken understanding that privacy was, for the most part, a theoretical luxury. Clothing, as ever, was both functional and symbolic. The wealthy wore wool and linen, occasionally trimmed with fur or dyed in modest shades of green or blue. Bright colours, such as crimson or violet, were generally reserved for the very rich or the very ambitious. Most citizens wore earth tones and layered garments, with men donning doublets and hose and women wearing long gowns and linen head coverings. Shoes were usually made of leather, but wooden clogs were also common, especially among the lower classes. These clogs, it bears mentioning, made a distinct sound when walking, and an even more distinct sound when dancing, particularly in groups. The people of Strasbourg were overwhelmingly Christian, Catholic to be specific, although the tremors of Lutheranism were beginning to ripple outward from Wittenberg. In 1518, Martin Luther had only recently posted his 95 Theses, and while Strasbourg would eventually become a Protestant stronghold, the seeds of religious reform had not yet fully taken root. Nonetheless, the city housed a variety of religious institutions: churches, monasteries, convents, and chapels, each governed by its own rules, rituals, and hierarchy of increasingly anxious clergy. Religion played a central role in shaping worldview. Illness, crop failure, and sudden misfortunes were often interpreted through a theological lens. Divine punishment, saintly intercession, and the ever-present spectre of sin coloured even the most mundane events. Pilgrimages were undertaken. Relics were venerated. Miracles were believed, if cautiously. Entertainment, though more limited in scope than today's offerings, was not absent. People attended seasonal fairs, watched travelling performers, and gathered for feast days, many of which were marked by processions, pageantry, and community meals. Music was primarily communal, and dancing under normal, voluntary circumstances was a popular pastime during weddings and festivals. However, these dances were usually performed with enthusiasm, consent, and a strong awareness of social propriety. It is within this context that the events of the dancing plague become so striking. The idea of dancing without music, without festivity, and most crucially without stopping, would have been not just odd, but profoundly unsettling. It violated the social order, it disrupted the expected rhythms of communal life, and it did so not with swords or sermons, but with feet. Food culture was deeply regional, based on availability and tradition. Bread was the staple of most diets, accompanied by beer, cheese, cabbage, and preserved meats. For the poor, meals were simple and repetitive. For the wealthier classes, spices and imported delicacies added variety. The grain used to make bread, particularly rye, would later feature in some explanations for the dancing plague, but at the time no one suspected their breakfast of harbouring anything more sinister than occasional weevil. Hygiene, by modern standards, was perfunctory. People bathed infrequently, and while public bathhouses still existed in some areas, they were falling out of favour due to moral concerns and the spread of disease. Instead, cleanliness was pursued in parts and with limited enthusiasm. Hair was covered, bodies were layered, odours were endured. Education varied widely. Boys from wealthier families might attend Latin schools, where they learnt scripture, rhetoric, and arithmetic. Girls were more often taught domestic skills at home. Literacy was not widespread, but neither was it rare. Religious instruction was often the first and sometimes the only formal learning many people received. Books were scarce and expensive. and most learning was oral, practical, and highly localized. Medicine, such as it was, straddled a strange border between the empirical and the metaphysical. Physicians trained in Galenic theory believed in the balance of humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was often treated with bloodletting, herbal remedies, or prayer. Barbers performed minor surgeries. Midwives oversaw childbirth. And for matters of the soul or those inexplicable ailments that defied medical categorization, people turned to clergy. Mental illness particularly was poorly understood. Sufferers of what we might now recognize as neurological or psychological disorders were often labeled as possessed, cursed, or afflicted by divine displeasure. Melancholy, hysteria, and visions were described in detail by chroniclers, but rarely treated in ways we might consider therapeutic. It's worth noting that Strasbourg in 1518 was not a city untouched by hardship. The early 16th century was marked by periodic famine, outbreaks of disease, and economic strain. Just a few years prior, the region had suffered through harsh winters and poor harvests. Grain shortages led to rising prices. Plague, though not at epidemic levels in that year, still loomed large in cultural memory. Life was often precarious. People endured, but they did not always flourish. Social hierarchy was rigid, but not entirely immobile. Nobles, though fewer in a city like Strasbourg, still enjoyed privileges and property. Merchants and guild members occupied the prosperous middle tiers. Labourers, journeymen, and the poor made up the majority. Women, though essential to household and economic life, had limited legal rights and social autonomy. Their roles were defined by family status and marital circumstance. A widow might enjoy more freedom than a young wife, but also more scrutiny. Community life was intense. People knew their neighbours. They borrowed, argued, traded, and gossiped. News travelled by word of mouth, and even the smallest deviation from expected behaviour could prompt collective concern. A person who danced uncontrollably would not be seen as quirky, but as potentially dangerous or divinely afflicted. Festivals and religious feast days punctuated the calendar, offering temporary relief from routine. Carnival, Pentecost, and Saints' Days brought music, costumes, and performances. These were sanctioned moments of inversion, during which norms could be gently, if briefly, suspended. But even in these moments, dancing was ritualized and celebratory, not compulsive. All of this is to say, when a woman stepped into the street and began to dance without music, without reason, and without ceasing, the response was not simply curiosity. It was fear, confusion, and eventually attempts at containment. The Strasbourg of 1518 was not a place unfamiliar with suffering, but it was a place where suffering usually had explanations. Bad weather, bad bread, bad humours, bad omens. The dancing plague offered no such clarity. It did not follow the patterns of known illness. It spread, not by touch but by observation. It confounded priests and physicians alike. And so, the people of Strasbourg watched. They prayed, they whispered. Some joined in, others looked away. All, however, were caught in the slow realization that something, though no one could quite say what, had begun. By 1518, Strasbourg stood as a modest but strategically situated economic hub, quietly prosperous and surrounded by gently rolling fields, riverside woodlands, and trade routes that had been in use, some say, since Roman times. Nestled along the west bank of the Rhine River, the city owed much of its steady growth to geography. Though it did not boast the opulence of Venice or the grandeur of Paris, Strasbourg possessed something perhaps more valuable: stability, at least in theory. The economic structure of the city was rooted in trade and artisanal production. Markets bustled with the sale of textiles, leather goods, meat, salt, spices, and most pertinently bread. The bread of Strasbourg, made largely from rye and wheat, sustained the city's population, and the regulation of its ingredients was a matter of civic importance. Bakers operated under strict guild standards, ensuring consistent weights, fair prices, and, ideally, edibility. Guilds dominated much of the local economy. These were not merely clubs for craftsmen, but legally recognized organizations with far-reaching authority. Bakers, butchers, weavers, tanners, coopers, and smiths each had their own guild, each with its own rules and obligations. Prices were negotiated. Apprenticeships were supervised. Quality was monitored with a level of attention that, in retrospect, may have rivaled that of some modern regulatory bodies. Merchants benefited from Strasbourg's access to river transport. The Rhine served as a watery highway, moving goods north to the Netherlands or south to the Swiss Confederacy. Barges floated past timbered houses and under arched bridges, carrying grain, wine, timber, and occasionally more exotic goods like saffron, almonds, or bolts of fine silk. Strasbourg's position near the borderlands of France and the Empire made it a crossroads of commerce and culture. The result was a city that was neither poor nor spectacularly wealthy, but quietly functional, proud of its prosperity and wary of anything that might disrupt it. Coinage came in many forms, as one might expect in a pre-centralized banking world. Local currencies mingled with foreign ones. The Strasbourg pfennig, the Rhenish gulden, and other coins clinked in merchant purses. Barter still occurred, especially in rural areas. The concept of money was familiar but not always standardized. A transaction could include silver, eggs, or on rare occasions a goat. Wealth distribution was, as usual, uneven. A small number of families held significant power, land, and influence. These were the patricians, merchants, and former nobles who had, over generations, embedded themselves in the city's governing bodies. Their homes were large, their windows had glass, and their children were literate. Below them were the guildmasters and journeymen, followed by apprentices, labourers, and the poor, many of whom lived day to day, especially during years of bad harvests. It bears repeating that 1518 followed a period of agricultural hardship. Several years of erratic weather, some scholars suggest the lingering effects of what is now called the Little Ice Age, led to crop failures across the region. Bread prices rose, hunger increased. Malnutrition, while not universal, was widespread enough to influence public mood and physical resilience. A hungry population, subjected to uncertainty and hardship, becomes more vulnerable not only to disease but to suggestion. Some have suggested this economic strain may have played a subtle role in what followed, though it cannot be proven. It remains suggestive. The geography of the region contributed to both its prosperity and its isolation. The Rhine, while navigable, also functioned as a boundary. Beyond it lay the Vosges Mountains to the west, and the Black Forest to the east. Strasbourg's surrounding countryside included vineyards, orchards, and farmlands, interspersed with small hamlets and monasteries. Roads existed, of course, but travel was slow, often dangerous, and rarely undertaken without cause. Weather, too, mattered. Summers could be hot and humid, winters bitter and wet. The summer of 1518, according to local records, was particularly warm. This warmth, combined with previous years' instability, led to speculation about the spoiling of grain stores. Mold, especially ergot, thrives in moist, warm conditions, and ergot, as it happens, contains alkaloids that can induce convulsions, hallucinations, and just possibly dancing. The idea that spoiled grain might cause not only sickness but involuntary movement is not new, nor is it confirmed. Yet the presence of mouldy rye in the diets of the lower classes, particularly during a warm summer following a difficult spring, remains one of the more physically plausible explanations for what took place. The rich, it should be noted, ate white bread, less nutritious but less likely to carry ergot. The poor, by contrast, consumed dark rye bread, often in large quantities. This bread was heavy, nutritious, and if improperly stored, potentially mind-altering. Transportation within the city was predictably slow. Most people walked, carts rumbled along the cobbled streets, horses were expensive and largely reserved for the wealthy or for pulling goods. Ferries crossed the river. Messengers on foot carried news between towns. A letter sent from Strasbourg to another part of the empire might take weeks to arrive, assuming it arrived at all. Despite these challenges, information still flowed through merchants, clergy, travellers, and rumour. The economy of gossip was robust, if unregulated, and it is within this context that reports of strange behaviour could spread rapidly and unevenly, like ripples in a pond, disturbed by an unseen hand. The economic life of Strasbourg in 1518 was one of modest predictability. Bread was bought, cloth was woven, shoes were mended, taxes were levied. People worried about prices, about weather, about their next meal. Into this carefully balanced system, this mildly anxious equilibrium, stepped a mystery that could not be quantified, priced, or taxed. People began to dance, and not because they had been paid to, or invited to, or compelled by celebration. They danced without reason, and perhaps more unnervingly without profit. No one sold tickets. No merchants hawked refreshments. The Guild of Musicians, while later hired to accompany the dancers, was not consulted in advance. In a city where everything had its place, its price, its procedure, its ledger, this was chaos. Not violent chaos, not even especially loud chaos, but economic disruption, all the same. Who would buy bread when dancers collapsed in the market square? Who could sell cloth while neighbours trembled and twitched along the riverside? What sense could be made of feet that would not stop moving? Strasbourg had survived famines. It had endured minor plagues, fires, and religious tension. But it had not, until now, faced an economic and geographic challenge quite like this one. A mystery that moved not along trade routes but down alleyways. A plague not of flesh but of rhythm, and it had only just begun. The event that would become known as the Dancing Plague of 1518 began, quite unexpectedly, with a single woman stepping into the street and dancing. There was no music, no festival, no announcement. It was, by most accounts, a quiet morning in Strasbourg when she began to move. Her name was Frau Tropfe. What we know of her is minimal, less a biography than a historical whisper. She may have been the wife of a craftsman or a merchant. She may have lived in the narrow lane called the Frauengasse. But these details are speculative. The only point consistently reported is this. Sometime in mid-July she began to dance. At first onlookers were puzzled. Dancing, after all, was not in itself unusual. Strasbourgers danced at weddings, on feast days and during carnival. But this was different. Frau Tropfe was alone. She danced with no partner, no pattern, and most unsettling of all, no sign of stopping. She danced for hours, then days. Witnesses noted that she seemed distressed, not joyful, not mischievous, but driven. Her body moved with apparent compulsion. When she collapsed from exhaustion, she would rest briefly, then resume. Her feet blistered, her clothes were soaked with sweat, and still she danced. By the end of the first week, others had joined her. No clear explanation was offered. It is unknown whether these new dancers were acquaintances of Frau Tropfe, strangers moved by sympathy, or simply individuals overtaken by the same inexplicable urge. What is recorded, though with some variation, is that within 10 days over 30 people had begun to dance in public spaces. Their movements were erratic, their faces pale. They twitched and turned with no music, no pattern, and no relief. The city council took notice. At first they assumed the dancers were either performing a prank or acting under demonic influence. But as the phenomenon grew, so did their concern. Reports spread of people collapsing from exhaustion. Others cried out in pain but continued to move. Local clergy were unsure whether this was a spiritual punishment or a medical issue. Physicians leaning on humoral theory believed it to be a case of overheated blood. Their solution was, in retrospect, curious. They recommended that the afflicted continue dancing. The idea was to let the excess heat and excitement run its course. Like sweat from a fever, the dancing needed to be expelled. To that end, the city erected a stage in the public square. Musicians were hired. Space was cleared. The dancers were encouraged to move freely, as if somehow the chaos could be resolved by permitting its structure. One can imagine the surreal scene, professional players with fiddles and drums performing for an audience of twitching, groaning neighbours, none of whom had bought tickets or requested the show. It did not help. More dancers joined. Estimates vary. Some say the number reached 100. Others claim up to 400 people were affected before the episode subsided. Most modern scholars suggest a number somewhere in between, though the precise figure is unknowable. Some dancers were said to have died from exhaustion or cardiac failure. These reports are difficult to verify. The chroniclers of the time did not always separate rumour from observation. But the image of people dancing until death, while perhaps exaggerated, was powerful enough to persist across centuries. Eventually the city reversed course. Officials, seeing that their open-air concert had not cured the epidemic, sought other solutions, religious ones. They consulted clerics and monks. They revisited older beliefs. The idea that this was a curse or a form of divine punishment took hold. It was decided that the dancers should be moved away from the city, the destination, a shrine to St. Vitus in the nearby town of Saverne. St. Vitus was widely known in medieval Europe as the patron saint of dancers, nervous disorders, and those afflicted by convulsions. There was even a name for afflictions of this kind, St. Vitus's dance. Though what struck Strasbourg in 1518 was far more intense, the connection seemed promising. The afflicted were escorted, some still dancing, some barely conscious, to the shrine. There they were encouraged to pray, to make offerings, and to wear small crosses marked with the saint's name. Some were given red shoes blessed by the priests, a tradition associated with spiritual protection. Holy water was sprinkled, litanies were recited, and slowly the epidemic began to fade. It is unclear whether the pilgrimage cured anyone, but by late August or early September, the strange outbreak had diminished. Fewer cases were reported. The dancers stopped appearing in the streets. Life in Strasbourg, cautious and methodical as ever, resumed its usual rhythm. No single explanation was offered. The physicians, having failed with music and movement, offered no further theories. The clergy, never entirely unified in their diagnosis, claimed some level of spiritual resolution. The council, for its part, filed the events away, more concerned with the next harvest, the next tax dispute, or the next minor scandal involving improperly measured grain. But the mystery remained. Why did it begin? Why did it spread? And why, after weeks of inexplicable motion, did it finally stop? The records, though sparse, suggest a few constants. The dancers were not voluntary participants. They appeared distressed, often frightened. Some were reported to cry out for help. Others seemed entranced. Many had no memory of what had occurred once it was over. The dancing did not follow the patterns of performance. There was no joy, no celebration. It was movement stripped of music, compulsion without cause. Strasbourg, a city known for its structured life and regulated marketplaces, had no precedent for such behavior. The event disrupted not only the physical streets, but the mental order of those who observed it. How could a community so structured, so attuned to regulation and hierarchy, accommodate something so chaotic? It couldn't, and so the incident was, eventually, not solved but shelved. It faded into the background of memory, preserved only in reports, letters, and the quiet terror of those who saw it happen. Frau Troffea, the first to dance, disappears from the record after the outbreak begins. Whether she survived, recovered, or succumbed is unknown. Her role in history, however brief, is undeniable. She was the first step in a mystery that remains, to this day, unsteady on its feet. The dancing plague of 1518, like many historical oddities, resists clear authorship. It offers no villain, no clear hero, and precious few names. And yet, scattered across letters, council records and chronicles, a handful of individuals emerge, some central to the events, others peripheral but revealing. We begin, of course, with Frau Troffea. She is the name most associated with the beginning of the outbreak. She danced first. Whether she was a catalyst or simply the first observed case, we do not know. Some records describe her as the wife of a Strasbourg artisan. Others are silent on her background. No age is given, no motivation offered. Her dance, once it began, continued for days. Observers noted that she appeared anguished, not joyful. Her feet bled, her body trembled, yet she danced. After a week, she was reportedly removed from Strasbourg and sent to a healing shrine. Her fate remains uncertain. She does not reappear in any surviving document beyond the initial accounts, and yet her influence echoes through history. She was, unintentionally, the face of a phenomenon that would bewilder generations. Then there are the physicians of Strasbourg, whose names are mostly lost to time, but whose theories were preserved through city council records. These men, educated in Latin, trained in Galenic medicine, diagnosed the outbreak as a case of overheated blood. The prescribed treatment at first was more dancing. It is unclear whether any one doctor led this conclusion, or if it emerged through general consensus. Still, we might imagine one or more of them, a learned man in a long robe, perhaps balding, perhaps stern, standing at the edge of a crowd of convulsing citizens, murmuring that the treatment was working, that they simply needed to keep going, that the body, once purged of its internal heat, would right itself. That they were mistaken is evident, but their influence shaped the early response, including the decision to provide musicians and a stage for the afflicted. It was a rare moment in which medical theory and public performance collided with minimal success. The Strasbourg Town Council also played a significant role. This body, comprised of merchants, guild leaders and local elites, held considerable civic authority. Their reactions were cautious but deliberate. They approved the musicians, they monitored the outbreak, they debated religious interventions, and when the situation deteriorated, they sought assistance from the church. While few individual names are preserved, one figure occasionally mentioned is Peter Becker, a magistrate whose letters include references to the strange behaviour afflicting several dozen townspeople. His tone, according to one surviving note, was one of restrained concern. He did not panic, he did not speculate, he recorded. In many ways, Becker is emblematic of the civic response: methodical, reactive, unsure. On the religious side, Bishop Wilhelm von Honstein, the ecclesiastical authority of Strasbourg in 1518, deserves mention. Though not directly governing the city, his moral authority loomed large. Initially hesitant to classify the dancing as a spiritual issue, he ultimately approved the plan to escort afflicted dancers to the shrine of St. Vitus in Saverne. Whether he saw the outbreak as demonic, divine, or simply inconvenient is unclear, but his approval of the religious intervention marked a turning point. The city's leadership shifted from treating the dancers as patients to viewing them as penitents. At the shrine of St. Vitus, local clergy took responsibility for the afflicted. Their names, like the bishops, are largely unrecorded, but their actions are known. They provided the dancers with crosses, holy water, and red shoes, believed to hold protective power. The ritual was rooted in tradition, bathing, prayer, and symbolic purification. Some scholars have speculated that the clergy themselves may have framed the outbreak through the lens of saintly intervention. To have a crowd arrive in distress, seeking the help of St. Vitus, reinforced the shrine's spiritual importance. Whether the priests saw this as miracle, burden, or simply another aspect of their calling, we do not know. Several chroniclers and writers recorded the events, though none were eyewitnesses. Chief among them was Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and philosopher, who later reflected on the dancing plague in his writings. He classified the dancers as victims of what he called a choreomania, a term suggesting an uncontrolled, psychogenic compulsion to dance. Paracelsus divided the dancers into types: those who suffered from physical causes, those afflicted by spiritual imbalances, and those he believed were faking for attention. His tone is both clinical and judgmental. Though he wrote years after the event, his analysis shaped later interpretations, especially in the realm of early psychology. Another important, if indirect, figure is Sebastian Brandt, a Strasbourg native and author of The Ship of Fools, published in 1494. While Brandt died before the dancing plague, his satirical work captured the moral and social anxiety of the era. He had warned, decades earlier, of irrationality, vice, and communal folly. Though not a chronicler of the dancing itself, his cultural voice helped shape how such events were understood as signs of deeper spiritual or societal imbalance. There are also the musicians, anonymous and numerous, who were hired to accompany the dancers. Their instruments, likely fiddles, pipes, and drums, were meant to regulate the pace, give structure to the chaos. Whether they played by choice or under contract is uncertain. One imagines them on the makeshift stage, sweating under the sun, watching citizens convulse in rhythm with their music. Did they believe they were helping? Did they find the experience unsettling or absurd or tragic? The records are silent, but their presence remains one of the most haunting elements of the story. Music, meant to soothe or celebrate, became part of a strange civic experiment, an attempt to choreograph a plague. The dancers themselves, beyond Frau Trophia, remain largely nameless. They were citizens of Strasbourg, men, women, possibly children. Most seem to have come from the working and artisan classes. Their testimonies, if ever recorded, have not survived. What they felt, what they feared, what they remembered, these things are lost, but they were the core of the mystery. They did not dance in joy. They danced because something compelled them, and for weeks they moved through the streets, participants in a phenomenon no one could explain. Finally, we must mention the witnesses, those who stood at windows, who watched from doorways, who whispered in the marketplace. Their names too are gone, but their reactions shaped the event. They formed the crowd. They reported what they saw. They were the reason the council acted, the reason the bishop was consulted, the reason the story survived, because without them it would have ended as a rumour. The dancing plague of 1518 did not announce itself with thunderclaps or trumpet blasts. Its timeline unfolds in quiet increments, like a fever slowly rising, a rhythm building unnoticed, until quite suddenly the streets of Strasbourg were filled with feet that would not stop moving. The first reported incident occurred in mid-July, likely between the 12th and 15th. Frau Trophia, a seemingly ordinary woman, stepped into the street outside her home in the Frauengasse and began to dance. There was no music, no audience, no apparent reason, but dance she did, alone, persistently, and without stopping. Over the course of 3 to 6 days, depending on which chronicle one consults, her solitary dancing attracted attention. She collapsed occasionally from exhaustion, only to rise again and resume her movements. By the end of that first week, several more individuals, perhaps a dozen, had joined her. By late July, the number of afflicted dancers had risen to between 30 and 50. Their symptoms were remarkably consistent: compulsive dancing, inability to rest, visible distress, and, in some cases, physical collapse. Some eyewitnesses claimed that the dancers cried out for help as they moved. Others appeared dazed, glassy-eyed, caught in a trance. The Strasbourg Town Council, having hoped the episode would pass on its own, now began to take action. Based on the recommendations of local physicians who, operating under Galenic medical theory, believed the cause to be overheated blood, it was decided that the best treatment was to allow the dancers to continue. Thus, around the last days of July, a stage was erected, space was cleared, musicians were hired to accompany the dancers. City records suggest that the council genuinely believed this would allow the afflicted to dance it out, and for a time this bizarre prescription continued. Spectators watched, the afflicted danced, the musicians played, all in the oppressive heat of an Alsatian summer. By early August, the situation had escalated. The number of dancers had grown. Some sources claim over 100, others suggest even more. With little improvement and growing concern, the authorities began to reassess. Reports of injuries and exhaustion increased. Rumours of fatalities began to circulate, though no exact death toll was ever confirmed. Mid-August marked a turning point. The civic authorities, likely spurred by public pressure and the failure of their musical intervention, shifted their strategy. They consulted with the church. The dancing, they now suspected, may not be a medical issue but a spiritual one, perhaps a curse, a possession, or divine punishment. The decision was made to transport many of the afflicted to the shrine of St. Vitus in Severn, a town roughly 30 kilometres away. The timeline of this religious intervention is vague, but sources suggest it began in the 2nd or 3rd week of August. Those still dancing were led either walking, supported, or by cart to the shrine. There they were subjected to rituals intended to banish the affliction, prayers, immersion in holy water, offerings, and the wearing of red shoes blessed by clergy. By the end of August or early September, reports of new cases declined. The dancing slowed. The streets of Strasbourg gradually returned to normal. The musicians were dismissed. The stage disassembled. The council turned its attention to other matters. The plague, it seemed, had ended. But what of the evidence? In truth, very little physical documentation remains. Most of what we know comes from contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles, city council records, letters, and retrospective medical commentaries. These sources vary in reliability, tone, and detail. One key source is the chronicle of physician and alchemist Paracelsus, who, although writing several years after the event, collected reports and interviews. His description classifies the outbreak as a form of choreomania, a word derived from chorea, the Latin term for dance. He theorized that different dancers were driven by different causes: divine punishment, unbalanced humors, or even voluntary hysteria. Another frequently cited source is the Chronicon Alcetiae, a regional chronicle that describes the events in broad strokes. It records the basic facts: a woman began dancing, others joined, some died, and the city responded with music before ultimately turning to religion. The Strasbourg city archives reportedly contain council records from that year referencing unusual public behaviour and civic measures taken, including the hiring of musicians. However, these records are administrative, not narrative. They confirm that something happened, but they do not explain what it was. There are also letters and correspondence from neighbouring cities which mention the incident in passing, often in bemused or anxious tones. These provide valuable context. The event was noticed beyond Strasbourg, and it was regarded as peculiar enough to merit mention. Some 16th century illustrations exist, showing groups of dancers, often in distorted postures, sometimes accompanied by skeletal figures or symbols of madness. These were likely produced years later, and are more reflective of artistic imagination than journalistic accuracy. No known medical records in the modern sense survive. The afflicted were not examined according to empirical standards, nor were their names or symptoms catalogued. We have no autopsies, no blood samples, and no precise definitions of what dancing entailed. Was it convulsing, twitching, staggering? The term, in early 16th century context, may encompass a variety of involuntary movements. The evidence of fatalities is especially slippery. Some chroniclers mention people dancing to death. Others imply it but do not confirm. Later retellings, particularly those of the 17th and 18th centuries, greatly exaggerated the death toll, some claiming hundreds perished. Most modern historians believe the number of deaths, if any, was likely low and not systematically recorded. Interestingly, no court cases, prosecutions, or criminal accusations followed the plague. This supports the idea that the event was regarded as an illness or divine affliction, not as a crime or rebellion. The timeline of events, while narrow, follows a clear shape. 1. Mid-July, Frau Troffea begins to dance. Late July, dozens join her, musicians hired. Early August, numbers increase, injuries and public concern grow. Mid-August, religious intervention initiated, pilgrims sent to St. Vitus' shrine. Late August, early September, cases decline, outbreak ends. No recurrence of this exact scale was ever documented again in Strasbourg. Similar episodes were reported in other parts of Europe in earlier centuries, including in Aachen, Cologne and Metz, but none with as many documented civic responses. What we are left with, then, is a timeline that seems straightforward, but is haunted by ambiguity. The events followed a sequence. They escalated, they resolved, but the why, the underlying cause, remains elusive. The evidence, while fragmentary, is consistent on one point. Something happened. People danced. They did not want to. They could not stop. And then, just as strangely as it began, it was over. The streets of Strasbourg are quiet now. The dancers are gone. The stage has long since been dismantled. The fiddles packed away. The sweat has dried. The red shoes have been forgotten in corners of shrines. The cobblestones, once rattled by restless footsteps, now feel the more familiar weight of ordinary commerce, carts, feet, and the occasional impatient chicken. And yet, the mystery remains. The dancing plague of 1518, despite the distance of centuries, has never quite left us. It continues to appear in textbooks, documentaries, podcasts, and late-night conversations between people who are, themselves, a little sleep-deprived. And that's because it offers us something rare, a truly unsolved event. One with just enough evidence to be real, but not nearly enough to be explained. What makes it so enduringly strange is not just that people danced uncontrollably. It's that no one knew why then, and we still don't now. Historians have proposed numerous explanations over the years. Some suggest mass hysteria, a kind of collective psychological breakdown brought on by stress, hunger and uncertainty. Others point to ergot poisoning, caused by a hallucinogenic mold that grows on damp rye, a theory popular among modern scholars, but still lacking definitive proof. Still others speculate on spiritual fervour, that the dancers were caught in a trance-like religious state, not unlike those seen in ecstatic medieval pilgrimages. There are even those who suggest neurological illness, perhaps similar to epilepsy, or a form of what we might now call functional movement disorder. But none of these explanations quite satisfy. Each has evidence, each has problems. And so we circle the same theories again and again, like dancers retracing the same weary steps. It bears repeating that the historical record is frustratingly thin. We have no interviews with the afflicted, no detailed reports from physicians, no diaries, just the blunt notes of city officials, the passing remarks of chroniclers, and the increasingly confused commentaries of future scholars. And perhaps that is part of the allure, because the dancing plague resists our modern desire for resolution. It cannot be solved in a podcast episode, or closed with a DNA test, or unpacked with a single study. It exists as a kind of historical echo, unsettling not because of its violence, but because of its odd, rhythmic persistence. There is something faintly ironic in the fact that a group of people danced uncontrollably, in a city known for its regulation, its civic order and its love of guilds, statutes and proper grain weights. Strasbourg in 1518 was not a chaotic place. It was not a battlefield. It was not a carnival town. It was a place of procedure. And yet the dancing came anyway. What does this tell us? Perhaps something about human fragility. About how even in times of order, the mind and body may rebel in unpredictable ways. About how stress, economic, spiritual, social, can manifest not in silence but in motion. Or perhaps it tells us less about the dancers and more about ourselves. About our tendency to want answers, to classify, to label, to draw conclusions, even when the evidence is as wobbly as a pair of tired knees on a hot cobblestone street. The dancing plague continues to fascinate because it resists all of this. It refuses to sit still. It reminds us that history is full of gaps, of unfinished stories, of phenomena that simply don't fit the templates we have prepared for them. And so scholars continue to debate. Psychologists propose theories of conversion disorder. Sociologists cite the pressures of a harsh economic year. Cultural historians look at fear, at religious anxiety, at hunger and trauma. Medical researchers wonder if something in the bread or the brain was responsible. Yet no definitive conclusion emerges. What's particularly interesting is that this unsolved mystery has spawned more questions than it answered. Why did the outbreak end so suddenly? Why did the treatment with music not work, or perhaps make it worse? Why was it centered in Strasbourg and not in neighboring cities with similar pressures? There are no clear answers. And perhaps that's precisely what makes this story so useful. Not just as a historical curiosity, but as a kind of metaphor. A reminder that the human experience is not always orderly, that sometimes for reasons even the best educated councilman cannot fathom, people will simply dance, unasked, unbidden, and unstoppable. Maybe they were sick, maybe they were desperate, maybe they were simply overwhelmed, but they danced. And now, centuries later, we remember them, not by name, not in detail, but through the motion that baffled their peers and captivated posterity. Frau Trofea's footsteps are long faded, the musicians are silent, the shrine of St. Vitus stands, but the red shoes are gone. The records sit quietly in archives, but the story continues, because we restless, thoughtful, and occasionally insomniac keep coming back to it. We ask again what happened, and the silence of history answers with a shrug, with a half-step, with the ghost of a drumbeat, with no answer at all, and so the mystery of the dancing plague of 1518 remains unsolved. Despite the physicians, the clerics, the chroniclers and the musicians, despite the saints, the theories and the shoes, despite the centuries of speculation, we may never know what truly happened, and perhaps that's what makes history so endlessly fascinating and so perfectly suited for a good night's sleep. Good night.